All right. So good evening, everyone, and welcome back to with the Emerging Revolutionary War, our Rev War Revelry. So today, though, we step out of the Revolutionary War with one of a good friend and great historian, Tom McMillan, who hasn't had enough of the Armistead family and has decided to come back. Has just recently wrote a book called Our Flag Was Still There, the Star-Spangled Banner that survived the British and 200 years, and the Armistead family who saved it. And like to promote the book because after I finished it, being a native Baltimorean, I literally drove to DC to go see the flag. And anyone who lives in the DMV knows that if you're motivated enough to drive into DC on a day you don't have to be in the DC, it has to be a good history book. So I want to get that preface out. Tom, thank you for joining us tonight. We really appreciate having you here on the program.
Bill, it's great to be here. There really isn't a War of 1812. There isn't an emerging War of 1812, so it's great to be on the emerging Revolutionary War. I appreciate the fact that after reading your book, you went to the Smithsonian. It is a special place, and it really started affecting me more. It always affected me when I was there, but after I researched and wrote, it affects me more every time, that knowing the story of how that flag got there.
Lose you already. Oops, God. Are you still there?
I'm here. Yep.
Okay, sorry. Had a little bit of a technical difficulty, but how are you? We're back there. So, Tom, if you don't mind giving a little background on who you are and how you came across the Armistead and this connection.
Yeah, I'm retired after a 43-year career in sports media. So I worked in sports media and communications. But history was always my passion. History, for a lot of people, sports is their escape from their life. When you work in sports, history was my escape from sports. Been a Civil War nerd for a long time and always go to Gettysburg and now volunteer at Antietam. And about 10 years ago, I started writing some books. I wrote about Flight 93, and then I wrote 2 books on Gettysburg. And once you learn how to do it, it's a good hobby. It keeps you out of trouble. And the biggest thing is research and learning. I think all of us, Phil, who are into history, we want to learn. And at least half of the fun of doing these books is learning and researching. And I did, as you mentioned, I had done one of my Gettysburg books on Armistead and Hancock, on Lewis Armistead, the Confederate general who led a brigade in Pickett's charge. And by doing research in his family, I thought, this is a pretty incredible family. And someone who should be more famous is his uncle, George Armistead, who was the commander of Fort McHenry and essentially the creator of the Star-Spangled Banner. And not a lot of people know that story. But the family history goes back in military, goes back to the 1680s. So I just thought, after having done the Civil War book, I looked at this and I said, nobody's done this story. Nobody knows about George Armistead. I'm going to try to do this and see if there's enough there. Because you never, when you start this, you don't know if there's enough information. Maybe that's why nobody's written it. There was plenty there. Not only the Armistead family, and we'll get into the story of I don't want to give the whole story in the first 5 minutes, but it's kind of amazing how the family is the reason through 3 generations of George's family why it exists at the Smithsonian today. Like, why does it exist after 210 years? Most things don't exist that long, especially pieces of fabric. And this one does. It's a fascinating story of not only what it means, but how it got there.
So you had experience with the Armistead family. How did you make the switch from Lewis to George? And then, or what was that inspiration when you realized you had enough?
The idea of this actually came from the movie Gettysburg. There is a scene, one of the many fictitious scenes, right before Pickett's charge, where Lewis Armistead is talking to the British military observer Arthur Fremantle. And Fremantle says, I understand you're from an illustrious military family. And Armistead kind of grunts. He's getting ready for the battle. He's like, who told you that, Kemper? And Fremantle says, he tells me that your uncle was the commander of Fort McHenry during the War of 1812, and therefore was the guardian of the original Star-Spangled Banner. And he looks across the field at Cemetery Ridge and he sees the American flag and says, I do appreciate the irony of it all. And then it moves on, but it always struck me that connection, that's true. Why don't we know more about this guy? So digging in, I was able to, fortunately, the folks at the Smithsonian were just tremendous. I think a lot of people, I don't think a lot of people have ever asked them to go into their Star-Spangled Banner inventory. There's a 400-page file that I was able to access. But also one of the really cool aspects, and we can get into this a little more as we go on, I tracked down some direct descendants of George Armistead,
Yes.
a second great grandson and a third great grandson, who were so opening and welcoming. They didn't have a lot of information, but they had enough, and they pushed me on a path. And a story we can get into a little bit. They had some very iconic items in their home that, because of this research and the connection, they have now donated to the Smithsonian from George Armistead, and the Smithsonian is happy. Everybody's happy. So it was cool for me to have that little impact and get those really cherished items that were in a private home in Philadelphia all those years, and they're now going to be at the Smithsonian.
No, that's a little great teaser, because you did write that at the end of your book about how you went in and that walk up the steps, I think it was, and you ran into one of those major images. But we'll leave that right there unless you want to talk about it more. But that'll be a good segue into, you got to read the book, because every historian wants to walk into a place and be confounded by this in front of them. So but for those that don't know, I mean, unfortunately, the War of 1812, we actually have to put the name 1812 in the title so people know when we fought it. But Battle of Baltimore, of course, the British after DC coming to try to subdue. There's the land battle at North Point, and also the engagement at Star-Spangled Banner. So Armistead is there in charge of the fort, and he's the one, correct, that orders the flag to be made.
Yeah, he was, as you know, as we all know, the War of 1812 was actually lasted for 3 years. It's a really odd name for a war, but it wasn't going very well for the U.S. for about the first year and a half. And one of the few heroes early, one of the few victories was at a place called Fort George up in Canada, and George Armistead was one of the heroes. And in tribute to his service, he was given the honor of delivering captured battle flags to President Madison down in D.C. And he got down there. And I think Madison and his cabinet are starting to think, we better start protecting. The war's going to come down here out of Canada. It's going to come down here. Baltimore, decent sized cities today. It was the third largest city in the country back then. Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, bustling international port. He had served earlier at the fort, said, you young man are now going to be in charge at Fort McHenry. So that's a big challenge for Armistead. It was going to be a major post. And one of the first things he did, he was always fascinated by big flags. He wanted a flag so big the British couldn't help but see it from a distance. So it almost began as a symbol of defiance, but also a little bit of confidence to his soldiers. This is what we're fighting for, boys. You always hear now in sports of coaches and managers trying to build a culture. Well, he was trying to build that kind of culture at Fort McHenry. He was using the flag as that example. He had to increase recruiting and do a lot of other physical things too, but the flag was very important to him. And they sent it out to a Baltimore seamstress named Mary Pickersgill, and the assignment was for 2 flags. A gigantic garrison flag, which is 30 feet high by 42 feet wide. That's the one the British couldn't help but see from a distance. And they also wanted a smaller storm flag, which is about 17 feet high by 25 wide, because that would fly during inclement conditions. If the big flag was up during a rainstorm, got waterlogged, might be so heavy it would snap the flagpole. So you needed 2 of them. So she's working on 2 of them. And also the design at that time, Phil, was 15 stars and 15 stripes. People look at the cover of the book and say, why does it have 15 stripes? Some get mad at me, like, that's not the real flag. But back then we were such a young country. This is not long after the Revolutionary War. We thought we could add 1 stripe and 1 star for each new state. So that's why you have 15 stars. It wasn't until 1818 that Congress finally said, wow, we can't keep doing this. Imagine what the flag would look like today, that there were 13 stripes for the original colonies and 50 stars. So she delivers it August of 1813. So it actually flew at the fort for more than a year before the battle. And Armistead was convinced that if the British patrol came in from the Chesapeake, they would have seen that flag.
Yeah, but it's not the second one that she makes is the one that flies on September 14th, 1814 during the engagement, correct?
Yeah, well, we don't know exactly for sure. Nobody took the exact details, but it started raining. The battle started on September 13th. It went on for 25 hours. Yeah. It started raining during the afternoon. Sometime during that rainstorm, much of the battle was fought in a torrential downpour. They took down the big flag, put up the storm flag. Storm flag flies through most of the battle. It was the next morning, after the battle has ended, that the Americans, there's always a 9 o'clock flag ceremony by Army regulations, but in a moment of victory and triumph, they raised the big flag, and guns were fired and music was played. They played Yankee Doodle. They're taunting the British, and the British. In the book, there are 2 first-person accounts of this moment. One from an American soldier, one from a British sailor, who writes, how distressing it was as they pulled back to see the Americans hoisted a most splendid ensign on their battery, is the way he put it. And that's the moment, and that's what Key saw. And he's actually not released for 2 more days, but he finishes the song 2 days later on September 16th. So it happened. I always tell people too, the book is, as you know, I have to get into the anthem in the book. Naturally, that's why it's called the Star Spangled Banner. The focus is the flag. But I think what a lot of people don't realize about the anthem, when we hear lots of discussions over the years, is Key was not trying to write a national anthem. That was never his goal. He didn't say, wow, one day I'm going to sit down and write a national anthem. He was out on the water. He'd been detained trying to negotiate the release of a prisoner. He had a very unique view of this battle. He was merely writing about his experiences of watching the battle. So if you look at the 4 verses of the song, they're in sequence of what he saw. That's why the song is the way it is. That's why it reads the way it does. It's merely about a battle that he witnessed, and it's only 117 years later that Congress makes it the national anthem. Very patriotic song, but it took a long time for it to become official.
I mean, in lieu of Congress, that's actually a short time, 117 years. I mean, yeah.
Well played. Yes.
No. But no, it's also too, I mean, it's a unique story because Francis Key's out there trying to scared of release. I think this guy named Dr. William Beans, if I remember correctly. And actually Beans's grave is still in Southern Maryland today. And I was actually, they say beer doesn't do anything good, but a side tangent. I was at a brewery saying I was on a history thing, and the person goes, there's some old guy buried up there that was part of the Battle of Baltimore. And it happened to be Dr. Beans's grave. So
let's hear it for beer.
Yeah. So beer leads. So for those first, the RW knows that beer leads to good history. So, but Key's out there with Beans. It's 2 days later. And then Armistead here's the flag. What happens next?
Well, as far as we can go to the anthem a little bit, and then what happens with the flag.
Sure.
The one thing that we've all been taught, that Key wrote a poem. We've all been taught that you read it ever. Key wrote a poem. I try to dispel that in the book because that's not what happened. Key was an amateur. He was a bad amateur poet, but he was an amateur poet. But the tune that we know is the Star Spangled Banner. I'm not musically inclined, but very well known to Francis Scott Key and many Americans in 1814. It was a British song for an upscale British gentleman's club over in London, the Anacreonic Society. They had a tune called "To Anacreon in Heaven," which this song was written to. The society spread to the U.S. There were several of them in the U.S. And what people did back then was they would take familiar tunes, and rather than continue to write music, they would just rewrite the lyrics. So that song was rewritten numerous times by 1814 in the U.S. Silliness, activism. There was one written for President John Adams. Key himself had written lyrics to that tune in 1805, 9 years before the battle. There was a U.S. Navy had won the Battle of Tripoli, and they wanted to honor one of the soldiers in D.C. And Key wrote "When the Warrior Returns," and it's exactly to this tune. And he even starts to use some phrases I point out in the book. Nobody knows about that song. And the little-known third verse of a little-known song, he talks about the Star-Spangled Flag of our nation. Francis Scott Key in 1805. So he was inadvertently working on these concepts. So he didn't magically write a poem and someone said, wow, it fits exactly with this music. How did that happen? He was writing for that song. And it was, they distributed it. He took it to a brother-in-law 3 days after the battle, September 17th, who had been a militiaman at Fort McHenry. Said, we've got to get this out. So they printed out a one-page broadsheet, and they passed out 1,000 copies. The title of the song on the broadsheet was "The Defense of Fort McHenry." Key never called his song "The Star Spangled Banner" or anything. He just wrote the lyrics. We think his brother-in-law called it "The Defense of Fort McHenry," which is accurate, but mundane. And about a week or a month later, there was a performance at a theater where they first called it "The Star Spangled Banner." So that's kind of how the backstory of this song, which again, I consider myself, as you do, Phil, a pretty good student of history. And I was stunned at how much I didn't know about this story. And the little things that I did know, most of them were wrong or skewered. But the thing about the flag that got me and why it exists today is sometime after the battle, in a year or two after the battle, George Armistead went out, took it down off the flagpole, and took it home as a souvenir. This was in complete violation of U.S. Army regulations. He basically stole the flag. He stole government property. But it's because of that indiscretion that it exists today. It happened sometime before 1818 because he died of a heart attack just 4 years after the battle. And I do think he would have become much more famous had he gone on to live, because beyond that, because many of the heroes of the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson, Zachary Taylor went on to become president, Winfield Scott, a big name in American history. George Armistead, I think, would have been with those names had he lived, but he died, he died at the age of 38. But his family had the flag, and 3 generations of that family kept it for 90 years. They possessed it from the 18 teens, whenever he took it home, we don't know exactly when, until 1907, when his grandson turned it over. So they had this incredible patriotic piece in their possession. And to them, it was more a family heirloom than it was a patriotic piece. But because of that, that's why it exists today.
And so Armistead, and I think you talked about it in your book, Armistead actually gets sick shortly after the battle. And I think what you're saying leads potentially to his death 4 years later.
Right. He was sick, taken sick right after the battle. He was just exhausted. He probably didn't sleep for about 36 hours. And his wife, in his pension papers, writes that she always thought that this condition stemmed from pressure during the battle. Who knows? But it's certainly plausible from what we know. And
ironically, he sends his wife away to a small town of Pennsylvania, right, touring it. And we can tell our listeners or watchers, we'll give you $1 on what small town in southern Pennsylvania she goes to.
Yeah, she was pregnant. He was sending away from the danger. It's amazing where he sent her.
Yes. And so since we'll circle back to that, see if anyone guesses it here in a little bit, but we're not really throwing out too hard of trivia questions. But so he dies and it goes to his wife. And now his wife does live into, I think, 1860s, right? Into the time
1861. She lived until right after the start of the Civil War. Yeah, so it's in her possession for more than, she's the longest private owner of the flag, 40 plus years. She guarded it zealously. It made very few public appearances. Most people, especially outside of Baltimore, did not know it existed. It was their family heirloom. The first appearance was 1824. Tied to the Revolutionary War. It was when the Marquis de Lafayette made his grand tour of the U.S., the nation's guest. Big ceremonies in New York and Philly and Boston. They came to Baltimore in on a ship. She allowed the flag to be taken to Fort McHenry. It flew up the flagpole, and there was a big sign that said, "Welcome Lafayette to the land of the free and the home of the brave." And that in 1824 was the last time that flag ever flew from the Fort McHenry flagpole. I could only document, Phil, 3, maybe 4 times in the next 30 plus years that it was ever in public. They hold an anniversary ceremony of the battle every year. They still do, called Defenders Day. It made a couple of those. One of the Armistead relatives was running for president one year. It was there for a campaign rally. That's about it. It was really a private kind of thing. But her daughter, her partner in taking care of the flag was her daughter Georgiana. I think she was named for her father, Georgiana Armistead, born at Fort McHenry in 1817. But one thing they did, and forgive me if I'm jumping ahead to a question, but they did something that would be sacrilegious to us today. They cut off pieces of the flag and gave it to people as souvenirs. I talked to some conservatives. They said, we're aghast at that today, but that's just what happened back then. It was very commonplace. It wasn't disrespectful. So we think, there's no record of this, probably battle veterans or their families, or maybe placed in a casket, wanted a piece of the flag, and the Armistead ladies would cut it off and give it to them. So the flag at the Smithsonian that you saw recently, Phil, is 8 feet shorter than its original width. It's not 30 by 42, it's 30 by 34. That is not battle damage, which a lot of people think it was. That's the Armistead ladies cutting off all these pieces of the flag. It's why it's jagged. They wrote on it. They actually indicated that George himself wrote his name on the flag. Now, a lot of those things have faded, but these are just things that happened back then, ironically. So they're preserving it for history. They're keeping it as a family heirloom, but there is some damage done inadvertently because that's just, and they kind of kept it in a sack. They rolled it up and folded it in a sack. So it's incredible that it's still it's in weak condition, but it's incredible it's still in the condition that it was, because they didn't know that they were doing things that might be damaging the flag, but they were.
No, and actually part of the display is they actually have the canvas sack there at the Smithsonian's, which, I mean, it's just, I know if I speak for the conservators and preservators listening, that this sack, I mean, like they're probably just cringing because it's, I mean, how it probably put up in an attic or whatnot. I mean, not controlled, but
Absolutely. And
it's like the United States, durable. It survives and everything.
yeah,
and so
one
forth.
of one of the things I wrote this early in the book, one of the conservators said that when they were doing the most recent major rehab project in the early 2000s, she said that their motivation, it was a lot of hard work, was that the flag was a metaphor for the country. It's tattered and it's torn, but it survives. And the flag survives if the country survives. And I thought that was such a great quote. It motivated them and it motivated me as I was writing the story, because people should hear that. They should know this story.
No, that's, I think, one of the great things that you kind of go on both sides when you're writing this, is that you give the facts, but then you show like the emotion behind it, like with the conservators, and you had the great photo of them going, what, stitch by stitch, laying down and trying to pull and we can get more into that story.
Yeah.
But when I think you said the lady like looks up and there's a guy like saluting as they do it, and you're just thinking that the painstaking effort, that's what it's worth.
Yeah, we'll get into why they were reducing the stitches, but they were doing, when they did the work for those 8 years, it was always still on display to the public. You could go in and you would see them working on the flag. So you at least got to see some of the flag. This is probably 1999 to 2007. And one day, one of the conservatives, they were leaning over, taking some things off the flag, and she looked up and saw a multi-generational family watching, where the older gentleman seemed to be World War II era. And she looks up 20 seconds later and he's standing there at attention saluting her. And she said, you know, when you've been doing this for 5 or 6 hours and your back's aching, your shoulders aching, your knees are aching, that's why you're doing it. You're doing it for the American public. And that's what kept us going through all those years, to make sure we got this thing done the right way.
And it's amazing. I mean, it's still spellbinding. And you go there, and of course, you go to Smithsonian's, you're going to run into school groups, teenage groups, so forth. I mean, everybody's hustling, bustling, and you walk into that, and you still like, they've done a great presentation and everything of it, but just the flag, even teenagers just kind of stopped and they're spellbound by it.
It's silent. Yeah, it's almost like it's on an altar.
And so we actually, one of the people listening in just said that she was one of the Maryland quilters that made the historically accurate reproduction in 2013 for the 200th anniversary at Mary Pickersgill. So Cecilia Marzulli, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, but it's still, I mean, she knows how hard that probably is to do it in hand. And doesn't Mary, I think she has to move the operation out of the house because it's too big for her building.
They had to move it to a brewery. I mean, think how big the flag is. And the storm flag was 17 by 25. That's not small either.
No,
not 8 by 10. So, they dragged it over to a brewery as they were working, and all sorts of intricate sewing work that they did. And it was, when I looked at the crew, it was an all-female crew, but Mary was 37 at the time, but the rest of them were really young. It was her teenage daughter, 3 teenage nieces. There was a 13-year-old African-American indentured servant named Grace Wisher. And there was a slave girl in the house who the slave person, we don't know her name, but she could have had something to do with making the flag, or she did the chores to free up the other women to work on the flag. So there were a lot of hands working on this to get it done. It took 6 weeks, long hours, but they got, Armistead wanted it ASAP, and that's pretty quick to do that kind of work back in the early 19th century.
And I mean, they got paid the whopping somewhat $405.31 or something at the time,
which was pretty good money back then.
Yeah,
but now today you say, oh my God, they made the Star Spangled Banner for $400.
And to put an equivalent, I'd recently done something about, it was at the time of the Civil War, $1 in 1861 was like $36 today. So to put it in perspective, probably even 40, 45 at the time, the War of 1812. So wasn't cheap. But once again, before we move on from the flag, we have to show they did move to a brewery. So once again, history is done with beer. So that seems to be the theme going on here. So the flag goes to the daughter Georgiana in 1861, and then it stays in her possession and passes on to Eben, right? Is that
it was
Eben?
It was such a Louisa, the wife, knew that all the children wanted the flag, so it was by the terms of her will that she gave it to Georgiana. It was passed down by the will. The other siblings weren't happy with this, but Georgiana had done most of the work, and she always thought, because she was named for her father, that she got it. So yes, she became the next custodian, and then when she passed on in 1878, it went to her son, Ebenezer Stewart Appleton, and Eben Appleton, and he was the person who ended up. He was really cantankerous. He ended up. He wasn't going to be a great good PR person for the flag when he took it over in 1878. And much to his chagrin, in her obituary, it said that he now had the flag. So he gets all these requests for the flag. The last thing he wanted to do, he did take it. There's one he felt he had to it. In 1880, Baltimore was putting up a statue to his grandfather. So he thought, I have to take the flag for this. So he's in the parade. He's with the flag, and Key's granddaughter was there. It's great. He takes it back to New York after that, said, great time, but that's it. He locks it in a vault in New York City. No one outside the family sees it for 27 years. From 1880 to 1880 to 1907, no one outside the family saw the flag.
And he, so then he's the one. I mean, this is just a random question. I may not know. I was reading the book. I was like, I wonder if you could identify what vault in what bank in New York.
They've tried to, and have Scott Sheeds, the esteemed longtime historian at Fort McHenry, who's now retired but works there. That's been one of his missions. He's been trying to find where the vault was, but he just can't. He can't find it. Unfortunately, they didn't keep the greatest records back then. And Eben, he knew it was important, especially at the end, but he just didn't. Those folks, I think, they didn't realize what they had from a national perspective. Maybe until the very end. It was George. It was their husband, their father, their grandfather's heirloom. It was a family heirloom. That's why they were keeping it.
And so then Eben and Ebenezer is the one that. So how does it make it to the Smithsonian's? People were trying to get it. The Baltimore City Fathers wrote to him on the 75th anniversary, said, we have the flag, and he said no. And so they went to the Secretary of War and tried to go over his head, writing that, this isn't really George Armistead's flag. He took it. It's government property. This is our property. And the Secretary of War said, I agree with you, but possession is 9/10 of the law. And Eben, very uncharacteristically, conducts his own PR campaign, gets a couple of New York reporters to come to his apartment, and he holds up a portrait of his grandfather and says, does this look like the face of a man who would steal government property? Even though he did. And so it became very clear that he wasn't going to give up the flag. It made him more, how we all know people like this. It made him more adamant. You have to give it up. No, I don't. But it wasn't in finally early 1900s. He's getting into his 60s. He's tiring of all this. He doesn't want his kids to have to deal with it. He's thinking of donating it, maybe to the city of Baltimore, maybe the state of Maryland, until a relative, an Armistead relative, and the family's been here since the 1600s, so there are lots of Armistead relatives. He's a government job down in D.C. He said, there's this relatively new museum, National Museum, the Smithsonian. It was National Museum. And it was really quick. The Smithsonian has the letters back and forth. It took only about a month. And they convince him that he can loan the flag. You can still keep ownership, but you loan it for a number of years. Most museums will do that. So he loans it in 1907. He sends it there. And the first day there, one of the famous photos, it's inside the book, is they hang it from the side of the main Smithsonian building. The building still exists. They called it the castle. It's the one it's the visitor center. It looks like a castle. And you can see from the architecture of this picture, that's where they hung the flag and took a photo, and it ran in some papers. And that really is the first time people outside of Baltimore and Boston a little bit really knew the story of this flag. And it gets this surge of patriotism, surge of visitation. People loved it. And 5 years later, it went so well that Eben decides, I'm going to make this gift permanent. I always wanted the Smithsonian, with one stipulation. He knew there would be requests. The flag will never leave the Smithsonian. He made them put that in writing, and they agreed. And has it ever left the Smithsonian?
Only once, and I think he would have understood it. It was during World War II. 1942, the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. The Nazis had bombed London. We were worried about we didn't know what was going on. We felt threatened. And so we took some of our most iconic items from the Smithsonian, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and the Star-Spangled Banner, to a rural warehouse in Virginia. And so they were all kept in a warehouse off-site owned by the Park Service for 2 years, until 1944, things were determined safe, they came back. And the flag has been on display every year since then. So in effect, his edict was never violated because it wasn't donated anywhere, but they were worried about these. They took some of Washington's possessions, Lincoln's death mask, the desk Jefferson used to write the Declaration of Independence, and the Star Spangled Banner. All these items were taken because we were worried we might lose them.
And I mean, and that war, I mean, I'm sure he even would have realized, this is probably better to be in rural Virginia.
This is okay. Yeah. He would have been okay with it. Yeah.
And so, as you get the book together, I mean, these stories, how did you construct it? I mean, that was one of the things. It's a free flowing narrative, but I mean, you've got the Star Spangled Banner and the flag, and you're trying to build this history.
It was a challenge, and I knew the challenge when people hear Star Spangled Banner, the first thing they think is anthem. And again, as you've read it, Phil, there is a substantial amount of the anthem in here, but it's not about the anthem. It's about the anthem in connection with the flag and how it all happened. So I've written 4 books. This was probably the most challenging because it covered 200 years. From the I mean, there's some early Armistead family history, but from 1813, when the flag is made, through today, at least through 2008, when the modern display was open. And those are kind of the parameters of the book. That's a lot of time. And you also know that most people don't know this story. So unlike when you're writing about something like the Civil War, and we're writing to other Civil War nerds like us, you can take some things for granted. People know what Pickett's charge is. Yes. I realized in this book, there wasn't much I could take for granted. So there's that kind of battle of making it really basic without too basic. So, and I told the folks at Fort McHenry, because they were excited about the book, but I said, but the book isn't just about the Fort McHenry battle. It's about 2.5, 3 chapters of that battle, but then it moves on to the history of the flag and what happened the rest of the way. So it was kind of sequentially getting there on the story. Much as Key wrote that song in sequence, I kind of wrote this as I discovered it and as I picked up pieces. And as I learned more, because you've written books, Phil, I'm one of those who I don't do 100% of my research and only then start writing. I'm too anxious. I probably did 64% of the research, and I need to start writing and see where I am. And then you keep researching as you go. And sometimes you go back and you either correct something or clarify something. But I found that's the easiest way to do it. Because again, the research, the quest for knowledge is part of the problem. I had so much fun writing this book. The most fun book I did, for sure, because of the things I learned that I didn't know that I thought I should have known. How could I not know this? But we don't teach these things. So hopefully people who read it will think that's the value of the book.
And so, perfect. So talking about the value, I was waiting for this question to come in, and it does come in from one of the ERW historians, Mark Malloy, who's actually knows that whole speech that you just gave of Armistead. He knows it by heart. And so he asked, does Lewis Armistead ever talk about the flag or his uncle's service?
No, I wish he would have. In fact, one of my first ideas, Mark and Phil, was before I wrote the Armistead Hancock book, Civil War, I was going to write a book just about the Armistead family, the military history, keyed on Lewis and George. But I couldn't find enough connection between them other than blood. Lewis was born 1 year before George died. George was aware he was alive, might have met him once, but obviously didn't comment on it. And Lewis, we know that he knew about the family story, but he didn't really write anything or say anything about it. It's in the family history, so he would have known. And again, as I found in my Armistead and Hancock book, a lot of Lewis's papers were either lost or maybe lost in a family fire. There aren't a lot of Lewis Armistead papers. It's why not a lot has been written about him. I really originally had hoped to find that connection. That doesn't exist. So that's kind of why I split it into 2 books. But George is in the first book, and there's a chapter on Lewis and the Civil War family in this one, because it's all part of the amazing military history of the Armistead family weaves through all of this, not just the 90 years that they kept a flag, but since 1680, when the first Armistead served in the first horse militia down in Gloucester County, Virginia. They've been military people ever since 1680.
And Armistead's what? If I make sure I have this genealogy right, it's Walker Keith Armistead. Is that his father, who was also a great military mind as well? Yeah.
The one thing that I pointed out in the book that we jumped over a little at the beginning that I forgot to mention was the part of the military family, the heritage here. George and 3 of his brothers were professional U.S. Army officers in the War of 1812. professional. They didn't just sign up in patriotism because there was a war to volunteer. This was their careers. They had served in previous engagements or in the Army at different posts before that. George had three brothers, and one of those brothers, Walker Keith Armistead, was the third man ever to graduate from West Point. He eventually, later in his career, would become a brigadier general. That was Lewis Armistead's father. That's how Lewis got into West Point, because Lewis wasn't really qualified for West Point. He never got out of the freshman class, but when your dad's a brigadier general at that point, you got in. So yes, so it wasn't just, George wasn't in a vacuum as one guy who was just in the Army. They were in the French and Indian ancestors, French and Indian War, Revolutionary War. They were in the Whiskey Rebellion, putting it down with Washington. And then four brothers from the same family, U.S. Army officers in this war. Two of them lost their lives. And then George loses his life a few years later, and Lewis's father lived until the 40s. But they were military men through and through.
And so talking about the military men now, today, of course, George is buried in Baltimore. And then, of course, his nephew is. How does Lewis get there? I mean, that's...
Yeah, they're buried in the same plot in Baltimore. It's a vault. So they're in the vault. They don't have tombstones, but there are little markers there for Lewis Armistead and George Armistead. Yeah, when I was doing that previous book, I said, how did Lewis Armistead get here? It was because, well, first of all, when he died at Gettysburg, he died at the Spangler Farm, and he was buried in a shallow grave on the Spangler Farm. And his story might have ended there, except that an enterprising and cold-hearted Gettysburg doctor, knowing the Armistead name and the fame, decided he would dig him up because he thought the Armistead family might pay for the body. And he was right. In that book, I mentioned in this book as well, that I run some correspondence between the doctor and Lewis's first cousin down in Baltimore, Christopher Hughes Armistead, the son of George Armistead. He wants his cousin's body. So he pays $100, it's shipped to Baltimore, and he takes it to the cemetery, to Old St. Paul's, and they open the family vault, and he's buried there next to his Uncle George. So that's how Lewis gets it. For a lot of years, that was secret for a while during the Civil War. A lot of years, nobody knew. People in Gettysburg until the early 1900s had no idea where Lewis Armistead was buried. But now, and it's a private cemetery, I was able to get in. Sometimes you can get in, they do tours to take a photo of that grave site. But that's how they ended up in the same grave. And that was the original idea of the book. That's how it was going to end. They're buried together. But I just couldn't find, other than that, I couldn't find enough of a direct connection between the two of them.
And so as you, we can segue a little bit in the finishing part of the book, because you do have, a tie into current events and everything like that. And so, which I thought was a great way. Because the banner, the words, everything, we were kind of having this big microscope of American history. So what made you want to open that Pandora's box, I guess, so to speak?
With what is as far as
the modern day, the looking at the Francis Scott Key to make that and how hard was it to kind of walk that line?
Oh, you mean with the things that have gone with the protesters? Yeah, well, I thought it wasn't a part of my story. That's not what I was trying to tell. But I also think, being a realist and a former journalist, you cannot write about this story in 2023 and not write about what's gone on the last few years and put that in context. Yeah. So I tried to address all that as much as I could from a news standpoint, just to present what's going on. I just thought, part of me thought, well, it's not really part of the history of this story, what's going on. But I just thought it would have been irresponsible not to mention it. You have to do it. Yeah. People would have said, are you unaware this happened? So it was the final chapter. And then I ended up, closing with some. There's a music professor from Michigan who recently wrote a book on the anthem. He dissected the anthem, Mark Clegg, and he talked about those topics quite a bit. And I quoted him and some other people. Try to get some historians to talk about that story from all angles, and I tried to present it that way. And I know there are probably some people who think, well, yes. Why did you write about that? I just thought you couldn't write a story about this topic without addressing it in some way.
No, I actually, in all full disclosure, of course, I flipped through a book and usually ends up near the back or whatever, just to see the sources and so forth. So I did it with yours. I'm like, okay, where do you pull the stuff from and everything? Because and I went to that, I kind of read that backward. I really, okay, this is where he's going to end up. And I thought admirably that and then realizing you were a journalist, I was like, oh, okay, this makes sense on how he got to here. But I just wanted to commend you on how you presented the facts once through, and that is the culminating part of the story, because the flag does represent America and continues this conversation. But kudos to tackling modern.
Thank you. I
stuff.
appreciate that.
But the story too of the flag, one of the flag, the Armistead family did try to get it preserved, or when the Smithsonian's got it, there was a story about how they put a fabric behind it in the early 1900s. Is that correct? I thought it was a fascinating story. So
yeah, well, what happened, the cover of the book is a photo of the first photo of the Star Spangled Banner ever taken. It was in 1873, so it's 60 years old the first time anyone was photographed. It's with a Navy Commodore in Boston had written a book about the history of the U.S. flag, and he could never figure out what had happened to the Fort McHenry flag. And he wrote that he heard some soldiers went through Fort McHenry in the late 1850s. They sort of rolled up in a ball in the corner collecting dust. And that brought Georgiana Armistead Appleton out of the woodwork. She writes an angry, "How dare you" later, "That's my father's flag and I have the flag." But they start to communicate, and he says, "Has it ever been photographed?" And she said, "No." He said, "If you send it to me at the Boston Naval Yard, I'll photograph it." So she did. And after protecting it all these years, she puts it in a crate, sends it to this military guy in Boston, and he takes it out. He's going to hang it from a flagpole, and it's like, whoa, it's really weak. He knew it needed a backing. He's at a naval yard. They have old ship sails. So he has some guys sew a ship sail to the flag to give it some strength. And they hung it from the side of a building, and he takes that photo that's on the cover of the book, and he has a soldier stand in front of it. So you can see how huge the flag is. And if you look at it, you can see the stars missing. It's the ladies have cut off edges. It's tattered. But people will say, it looks like it's backwards. It is. It was displayed backwards for more than 100 years because, for reasons we'll never know, they sewed the sail to the front of the flag. You can see the little blue view up on the left. And once you do it, you do it. So it's displayed like that. And the first major rehab project at the Smithsonian was there a couple of years, 1914. They wanted to bring a flag expert in. The flag preservation expert, the leading one in the country, was a lady from Boston named Amelia Fowler. She comes in, and her crew determines that one of the problems right now is the sail is too heavy. That's causing damage to the flag. So we're going to take that off. We're going to put on a much lighter backing of Irish linen. So they did that. I have a photo of that in the book of them working at the Smithsonian. Two things. One, they put it on the same wrong side. They put it exactly where the sail was, so it's on the front. And as one of the conservators told me today, using the methodology of the time, they attached that linen with 1.7 million stitches. And the conservator said, "I can't believe they put 1.7 million stitches in our flag." But they did. And we look at it now, roll our eyes. That's how they did it back then. But it did help preserve it for 90 years. So, and when we talked the story earlier about the lady seeing the man saluting, that's what they were doing. It took the modern Smithsonian people in the early 2000s. It took them 10 months. They removed those 1.7 million stitches, stitch by stitch. I have a photo of the ladies. They're suspended over the flag, laying down, because you can't touch it. You can't lay on it. So they were suspended laying down. And that's why when they looked up, that's why their shoulders were aching and their knees were aching. 10 months to do all that. So that was really an incredible labor of love to get that done.
It is amazing. I mean, feat preservation and just patience that I probably will never have in my life.
You or I.
But as we get near the last quarter hour here, just kind of want to open it up to. Actually, I'm sorry. We got a question. Where is the storm flag today? What is its history?
We don't know. The storm flag has been lost to history. And as probably the Star Spangled Banner would have been had Armistead not taken it. I don't know that at that time they were proud of it, but I'm not sure anybody realized the full significance, as you often don't in the moment.
Yes.
We know through history there are things that, 50, wow, this is a great piece. So I think the storm flag probably stayed, and they flew it over Fort McHenry, and probably over time it got battered by wind and whatever. and no one knows what happened to it. Again, thank God the Army keeps such good records now, but back then they didn't. So it has been lost. Scott Cheeds, this is a story. I always hope maybe someday somebody will find a piece of it, but not to this day.
And I mean, too, it's one thing that's forgotten is although the British do depart, the war is still going. They may be back. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
not like we have time to start conserving. Oh, let's write the annals of this history.
They were worried in Baltimore the British were coming back. Because again, remember, this was a pass. The British weren't defeated militarily. It was a passive resistance. It's just the Americans withstood that 25-hour bombardment. Armistead and his men would not give up the fort. And the British eventually decided it was futile, and they pulled back. But because of that and some other victories that happened up in New York at about the same time, there were three events there, the tide of the war changed. And much like in the Revolutionary, where the British started to say, can we do this? Is this worth it?
And so here's another good staying on that topic. So thoughts on how the Fort McHenry battle has been remembered over time versus how the Battle of North Point has been remembered or not remembered.
Yeah, the Battle of North Point is not remembered at all by most people. And even if you go up there, it's hard. Even if you put it in your Google, it's hard to find the places. And they're there, but they're very small. You could drive right by them and never know they were there. There's some nice little places. You're walking on hallowed ground, but it's a developed area. And I know there are some people in Fort McHenry who think that was a really important part of the battle. That was a really important part of the war. And U.S. soldiers, mostly militia, fought pretty well there. I mean, they gave up ground. The British were the greatest military force in the world at the time. But when they were coming through Maryland earlier toward D.C., you talked about when they went to D.C. and burned the White House and the Capitol. The U.S. militia at that point, the Army, so to speak, had put up a defensive line at a place called Bladensburg. And it was one of the most humiliating days in American military history. There was bloodshed and fighting, but the British blew right through them. So much that it's referred to not so much as the Battle of Bladensburg as the Bladensburg races. You hear that, right? And so I think the British probably thought that was going to happen again at North Point. The naval ships were out there, but they weren't brought into action that first day, September 12th. I think they thought their army was going to get all the way to Baltimore, and you wouldn't need the naval ships. And the U.S. forces did give ground, but they were pretty stubborn. They stopped the British several miles short of the city, and that's why they had to call on the Navy the next day to try to get the city and the fort in a pincer. The Army would keep coming, and the Navy would bomb the fort in the smithereens, and they would take Baltimore both ways. And just think of it. I often think of this, Phil, the importance of both of those battles, everything put together as the Battle of Baltimore. If the British win that battle, we're talking about a completely different history of our country. I mean, the war maybe doesn't turn. I don't think that's hyperbole to say that. That it would have certainly been longer, and it may not have been the same result had Baltimore not stood firm.
And there's some that would have probably agree on this that's listening in that's saying, hey, burning Baltimore wouldn't have been the worst thing for the United States. But now being a native Baltimorean, I can say that about my city. But in jest, the two reasons that the British aren't successful at the Battle of North Point like they are at Bladensburg is one, it's the first time one of my ancestors actually fights for the United States. He's in the militia. So obviously that's a defining moment. But the second is because James Buchanan, the 15th president of the United States, is actually there at the Battle of North Point as well. So there you go. You have two stalwarts of American history. But
I think it is. I mentioned this earlier. I think it is important to mention is Baltimore's importance in the country back then. I mean, it's a decent sized city today, pretty important. Everyone knows, but it was it was the third largest city in the country back then. It was a bustling international port. There was Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore. Those were the big cities. So that's why they knew it would be a target. Its size and the fact that so much commerce was done, and ships going in and out. And the other thing is a lot of Baltimore was also an annoyance to the British back then because of the privateering that was being done. Ships going out on their own, pirating and stealing British cargo and causing all sorts of problems for British ships. Most of those, or not, a lot of those ships came from Baltimore.
Yeah,
and the British knew that. And
a nest of privateers, I think is what they call it.
Nest of pirates or the nest of privateers. So it was a target not only symbolically because of the size economically because of its port, and also because it was the privateers, many of them come from Baltimore, were doing a lot of damage to the British Navy. So the British really wanted to lay waste to Baltimore, and the people knew that. And imagine then how terrified they were when 3 weeks earlier they had gone into DC, which was a very small city back then, not much defense, but just walked right in and burned the Capitol and the White House. And it was, you always hear hyperbole. They said you could see some of the flames from Baltimore. I don't know if you really could or not, but certainly they felt the impact of those flames in Baltimore, and they knew what was going to be coming. So the population of that city was going to be tense for 3-4 weeks.
And if we stay on the theme of shipping and ships, we had a question from Barbara that came in. She had heard somewhere that Key was actually on his own ship and not a British ship during the battle. Any truth? I think
he was on. Yeah, it was their own ship. It wasn't necessarily, he didn't own it, but he was not on a British ship. Dr. Beans the British had come through when they were going to DC, had come through Upper Marlboro, Maryland, where Dr. Beans lived. And foot soldiers would sleep in the tent or on the ground, in tents or on the ground, but the officers would take over a nice home, and they took over Dr. Beans's home, and he treated him well. And he had a Scottish brogue. They thought he was kind of going to be at least neutral. When they came back on the way back to their ships after DC, this is 3 weeks before Baltimore, a couple of the soldiers were straggling, looking for loot, as often happens, booze maybe. And Beans and his friends don't like it. They take a couple of them prisoner. Word gets to the British, and they are furious. This guy who they thought was neutral is not taking some soldiers prisoner. Who is he? They send a detachment middle of the night, grab him out of his bed, old man Beans, shake him, treat him roughly, say, we're going to take you back to our ships and take you to Halifax in Canada. You may never see your family again. That's why the family had contacted Key. Could he go and try to negotiate the release of Dr. Beans? And he was teamed up with Key knew, he said, I'll do it, but they don't know who I am. He was teamed up with the U.S. prisoner of war exchange agent, Colonel John Skinner, who the British knew. So Key and Skinner were the negotiating team. They left on a ship. They got a ship out of Baltimore Harbor on September 3rd, going looking for the British. They run into them on September 7th. It took them 4 days. And the British welcome them aboard. They know Skinner, but they're planning an attack on Baltimore. This is less than a week before the battle. The British aren't interested in talking about releasing this old guy. They're worried about their battle, until Key pulled out some letters that he had collected from wounded British soldiers at Bladensburg who said they were being treated well by American doctors. And he shows them, and the admiral reads them, and he says, okay, if you're treating our guys well, we'll let the old man go. This is just a few days before the Battle of Baltimore. Key says, great, we'll head back now. It was September 11th. Not so fast, pal. You've heard us planning this attack. So you're not a prisoner, but we're going to detain you. We're not going to let you go until after the battle. They were totally confident they were going to win. And they may have even thought, having Skinner nearby, who was technically a U.S. government official, he might be able to accept a surrender, because certainly they would win the battle. So they were on their own ship, but under guard. And Scott Sheeds, the longtime historian, believes they may have even been tethered to the admiral's ship, so they couldn't sneak away. And which explains why Key would have had such an incredible view of this battle. He probably was not far behind the bomb ships and would have experienced and heard all these things that were going on. It's very frustrating that most of what we have from Key are the lyrics. He never wrote in detail about his experience other than lyrics. He never did an interview. He did a speech years later, but he was talking mostly about the emotions of what he felt. So we don't have the details that we have are from his lyrics. But she is correct. He was on their own ship under guard. Again, you often read he was a prisoner. It wasn't quite a prisoner. They were going to release him. And they did, in fact, release him on September 16th, 2 days after the battle.
Oh, it's a great question. Yeah, it's a little unknown. I mean, it gets in the Wikipedia article, it kind of gets scattered out quickly. So,
yes, it does.
But as we transition in the last few minutes, so the book is published, so it's out. Where can people get a copy, or where are you have any speaking engagements lined up?
Well, it actually just came out last week, so you're really starting your speaking engagements. I've got some radio interviews this week. They start to pile in because as it comes out, people are interested. I am speaking in Gettysburg over the anniversary days. They still on July 1st. They still like the Armistead connection. I have a couple of those coming out, and basically, it's in bookstores certainly, but I buy all my books online. It's easy to do it. Certainly Amazon and Barnes and Noble are easy ways. Simon & Schuster, the overall publisher, their website as well are ways to get it. And, it's just, as an older person now, I still like those hard copies, I like the page through the book, but it's amazing as you look at some stats of how your book is selling, how many audio copies sell and how many Kindle copies sell. So it's available in all those formats. And it's not my voice reading it. Only the famous authors get to read it. It's a very professional voice, much better than mine, who reads it. So it's available in all those formats. And I have an author's website, and I'm pretty active on social and Facebook. So as these things are coming in, and I'm scheduling some of them now, I'll be posting all that information.
All right, and if you want to get a hold of Tom as well, feel free to drop us a comment or shoot a message to Emerging Revolutionary War, and we'll connect you as well. And so before I forget, the trivia question we asked earlier, where did George Armistead send his wife? It was to the town of Gettysburg prior to the battle. So Armisteads and Gettysburg, they're interconnected. But with that, I'd like to leave the floor. Tom, if you have one last closing comment, thought you want to impart before we wrap it up here.
No, Phil, thanks so much. This has really been a great opportunity. I love what you guys are doing in Emerging Revolutionary War. And I think as the 250th is coming, it's really important. But thanks for including this, because this is really kind of an attachment to that story. And anybody, all of us interested in the history of military history, we're into the flag, right? And I just, as I said, I invite people to come along on this journey, because I know that I thought I knew a lot. I didn't know most of these things. So I'm hoping that as people page through it or read through it or listen to their audio version in their car, we'll come up with tidbits about this, and it puts it in context. And it's so important for us in history now, when it's not taught so much in schools, is to learn this, to learn the context of why we are the way we are because of what happened. And when people talk about the anthem and talk about the flag, this gives you some really foundational factoids about how it all began, and how one family, one enduring military family, had so much to do with that flag still being at the Smithsonian that you visited just last week, Phil.
So we appreciate the final comment. Just had a quote come in, and because you were too humble, Tom, they were saying that yes, you can get your book available at stores online, but one cannot have it signed by the author unless you go to Gettysburg or wherever you're going to be speaking.
And there will be more. There will be more of those, but right now, yes.
Yeah, no. So just the humbleness there. Thank you, Meg. There. Fortunately, we are starting to run out of time, but I just want to close by saying thank you all for taking an hour out of your Sunday to talk about the War of 1812, which is kind of the bookend to the American Revolution. We'll be back in 2 weeks. We're actually going to go up the coast to Boston to talk a little bit about the Boston Tea Party as we get closer to the 250th of America. So we got to create the country before we can have the national anthem and the flag. So see you guys in 2 weeks. For all those who are, happy early Father's Day to all those that are listening as well. Once again, Tom, thank you for taking an hour out of your Sunday. Greatly enjoyed the book. Go out and get it now that it's available to wherever you get your books. So be well, everyone, and we'll see you in a few weeks.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.